Hello and welcome to today's Association of Student Action for Palestine webinar discussion. My name is Ramzi and today we are delighted to be able to invite and host the esteemed Professor Rashid Khalidi. By way of introduction, Professor Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Modern Arab Studies at Columbia University. He received his bachelor's from Yale University in 1970 and a DPhil from Oxford University in 1974, and has taught at the Lebanese University, the American University of Beirut, and the University of Chicago. He served as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation to the Madrid and Washington Arab-Israeli peace negotiations from October 1991 until June 1993. And Professor Khalidi is also the author of 8 books, including The 100 Years' War in Palestine, Settler Colonial Conquest and Resistance, and Palestinian Identity, the Construction of Modern National Consciousness, and has co-edited 3 other books and published over 110 academic articles. He has written op-eds in the New York Times, Washington Post, and many other newspapers, and has widely appeared on TV and radio in the US and abroad. In today's discussion, we will be delving into his most recent book, The 100 Years' War in Palestine, which covers the history of settler colonial conquest and resistance in the context of Palestine. And in light of the recent 103-year anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, we'll be focusing on the early years of the Palestinian national movement and Zionism, exploring, as Professor Khalidi calls it, the first declaration of war, covering the period of 1917 to 1939. Hello, Professor. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. And thanks again for joining us. It'd be great to hear a little bit about your approach to writing the 100 Years' War in Palestine and for the audience to get a better insight.
Well, thank you for having me, and a good evening, I suppose it is for you in the UK. It's midday here in New York City. Let me begin by doing as you suggest, Ramzi, which is to say a little bit about how I came to write this book and why it's different from actually everything else I've written. I was urged to write a book of this sort, which is to say a much more personal book, and a book that is relatable and approachable for people who are not specialists, by my son and by others, who basically said that, you know, I've written quite a bit of academic, scholarly, mainly work directed at other academics, and that it was time for me to write something that was accessible to a general public, that could put a framework for the history of Palestine out there that didn't need a lot of footnotes, that didn't need a lot of explanation, and that was clear and had a narrative flow, and that was personal. And it was very hard for me to do this because my training since I was an undergraduate and my training as a graduate student and everything I've written has been, you know, standard history, i.e. in the third person, carefully footnoted, and so on. Even when I wrote books that were for more general public, they still fit that standard to which I was trained. And so I, under the impulsion of constant urging from my son Smaid and others, I set about writing this book. It starts, every chapter of it starts with either something out of my family's history, something out of personal narratives, something out of my own experiences, things that I was told, things that I witnessed. And it's written in the first person in many places. There's a whole chapter on the 1982 war, when Israel invaded Lebanon, besieged Beirut for 10 weeks, and ultimately perpetrated through proxies the Sabra and Shatila massacres in September of 1982. We were there in Beirut, my family and I, and so that chapter is narrated both through our experiences, but also via documents that I've been able to obtain. The book is rigorously documented. There are 45 pages of footnotes for those who want to see where I come to, how and why I come to the conclusions I come to. But you can read it without them. And I hope that I've succeeded in producing something that has a narrative flow that people can relate to, and that explains the history of Palestine in a way that, you know, doesn't require you to have a DPhil from Oxford, doesn't require you to be an academic or a historian or whatever. So in that respect, it's really different than any of the articles I've written, the scholarly articles I've written, or any of the books I've written or edited. I just want to say a couple words about the title. which is, I have here the US edition of the book. In the UK, you have a different edition with a slightly different subtitle. The 100 Years' War in Palestine, the subtitle in English is A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance. But in both the UK and the American subtitle, settler colonialism and resistance are included. And the reason I used this framing for this history was because I think the way in which the conflict is usually understood is completely false. This is not a tragic struggle between two peoples who are on a basis of equality and whose rights have to be seen as equal. This is and has always been an entirely unequal struggle in which a people living in its country, the indigenous population, was assaulted, was the victim of attack from without by a settler colonial project backed at every stage by great powers. It was never just the Zionist movement or later on the State of Israel that brought the Palestinians under siege or launched these successive campaigns against them. It was always Great Britain or the United States or Britain and France, or in some cases Arab governments, Arab regimes, which were engaged, each in a different way, in furthering this war on the Palestinians, and a war which was directed certainly by the great powers in support of the Zionist movement at transforming Palestine from a country with an Arab majority into a Jewish state, into transforming Palestine, in other words, from Palestine into the land of Israel. That's exactly what one of the most important leaders of the Zionist movement, Zev Jabotinsky, said in an article he wrote in the 1920s. I mean, our objective is to transform Palestine into the land of Israel. He, unlike most other Zionist leaders, made no bones in public about what the real objective of the exercise was, nor did the British have any doubts about that. So that's why I use that title. Why do I use the term settler colonialism and resistance? Because, again, I'm trying to dislodge an entirely false understanding of this conflict. It's not between two indigenous people. It's not between the Germans and the French. The Palestinian people are the indigenous population of the country. The Zionist movement brought in from Europe people who had a religious attachment to Palestine, people who could claim an attachment to Palestine, but people who were and saw themselves as Europeans, who were and saw themselves as part of a settler colonial movement. This is not some kind of hostile, postmodern attempt to smear poor little Israel by claiming that Israel is rooted in a settler colonial project. It is based on the self-description of the Zionist movement itself, the agency that bought a huge proportion of the land that was bought in Palestine by the Zionist movement. They ended up buying almost 6% of the land of Palestine by 1948. It was called the Jewish Colonization Agency. This is not some anti-Semitic smear by a bunch of enemies of the Jewish people. This is the self-description of one of the major financial agencies that purchased land for the Zionist movement in Palestine, the Jewish Colonization Agency. And that was typical of the self-view of the Zionist movement. They saw themselves as a national movement. Ultimately, they developed into a national movement and created a national project, which has created a nation state. But they started off and saw themselves as a settler colonial movement. The idea of settlements, the idea of settlers is not, again, some kind of anti-Semitic smear. It's a self-description by Zionists in the first many decades of the Zionist project. That changes with World War II. Colonialism comes into a bad odor. The era of decolonization arrives. Jabotinsky, he's not any old Zionist leader. He is the spiritual, intellectual, moral father of the revisionist trend of Zionism, which has dominated Israeli politics since 1977. Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, Benjamin Netanyahu, Ehud Olmert, every one of those prime ministers of Israel, in other words, most of the prime ministers of Israel, with two exceptions, since 1977, were apostles of revisionist Zionism founded by Jabotinsky. So he's not any old figure in Zionism. He's probably the most important figure, after perhaps Herzl, Weizmann, and Ben-Gurion, in the Zionist pantheon. Let me now talk finally about the topic of this webinar, which is the Balfour Declaration and its consequences. The way the book is structured I talk about 6 declarations of war on the Palestinians. And the first of them is the one that is issued by Lord Balfour in 1917. And it is central to my understanding and to the understanding I'm trying to advance with this book of what happened in Palestine. I don't think you can understand what happened. I don't think you can understand the patterns in what followed without an in-depth understanding of what the Balfour Declaration meant and how it was implemented. And so it constitutes the first of the 6 chapters of the book, which covers the period 1917 to 1939. And that's what I'm going to mainly talk about today. I want to say one last thing before I do that, which is that quite frequently I'm told that it's unfair to describe the Zionist movement as a settler colonial project, that it's unfair or incorrect or even worse, slanderous to do so. I've argued that historically there's every reason to do so because that's the way the Zionist movement saw itself. One's not making up things when one quotes Zionist leaders in that vein. But I think it's important to recognize that even though this has never been an equal struggle, even though the 2 parties are on a completely different basis in Palestine, the Zionist project, like many other settler colonial projects, produced a national entity, developed into a national movement. It started in Eastern Europe as one among several movements competing for the allegiance of Eastern European Jews who suffered enormous persecution, particularly in Tsarist Russia and also in the Habsburg Empire. I don't want to talk about the early history of Zionism. The point here, however, is that this movement had at its core an idea of providing a solution to what was called in those days the Jewish question or the Jewish problem, which involved a national outcome, creating a state for the Jewish people in Palestine, seeing the Jews as a modern people rather than a religious group, and seeing that their fulfillment as a people required the creation of a Jewish state. So, like many other settler colonial projects, the Zionist movement, which starts as a settler colonial project, developed into a national project and had national aims. We shouldn't look at this as something absolutely extraordinary. It's not absolutely extraordinary. It's unusual, but it's not extraordinary. I am living in New York City, on the island of Manhattan, which is not originally, it was not originally English or American territory. It was Native American territory. It was taken over by a settler colonial movement, which produced a national entity, which is the United States of America. Adjacent to the United States is Canada. On the other side of the globe is Australia. Next to it is New Zealand. These are 4 countries that started out as settler colonial projects and developed into national entities. And I think Zionism has to be understood in the same vein. It was both at its origins a settler colonial movement, self-described and self-understood, and at a time when colonialism was considered a good thing globally. But it has developed into a national entity, which is to say the state of Israel, and the idea of the Jews as a people, with the state of Israel as the expression of that. So let me now talk a little bit about the Balfour Declaration. I describe the Balfour Declaration as a declaration of war on the Palestinian people because of the specific terms of that long single sentence issued in a letter by Lord Balfour, the Foreign Secretary at the time, to Lord Rothschild, one of the heads of the Zionist movement in Britain. In it, as I'm sure all of you know, the British cabinet said that it would endeavor to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Those 2 terms had a specific valence in 1917. To say a national home and to talk about a Jewish people in terms of the way those terms were understood meant that Balfour and the British cabinet were arguing that the Jews had composed a specific kind of entity which had certain specific rights. They had certain kinds of national rights. They had certain kinds of political rights. This is extremely important because not everybody in the European imaginary in 1917 had existed within those kinds of entities. There was no Indian people with national rights and political rights in the view of British colonialism. There was no, one could go on and on and on. The Jewish people, however, were in this respect seen as having the same kinds of rights as national entities in Europe. This is very important because a group that represented at most 5, 6, 7% of the population in Palestine was being told, we will establish a national home for this people in a country which most of this people doesn't inhabit and which is inhabited by another people. The Balfour Declaration doesn't mention that other people. The Palestinians, Arabs, the word Arab, the word Palestinian doesn't exist in the Balfour Declaration. And that's the other reason why one has to interpret this as a declaration of war. Because the second phrase of that long sentence that constitutes the Balfour Declaration talks about the non-Jewish communities in Palestine being entitled to civil and religious rights. So one group was being elevated as having national rights, as having political rights, as being a people. The overwhelming majority of the population, 94% or so of the population, was not ever mentioned per se. They were the non-Jewish community. They were described by what they were not. And it was explicitly stated that the ceiling of the rights they could command did not include national or political rights, were simply reduced to civil and religious rights, i.e. they could bring suit in court of law, they had property, they could worship. They did not have the right to political representation. They did not have the right to national expression, according to the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration is not only important because it expresses the views of the greatest imperial power up to that point in history, or the power which was about to become the victor a little more than a year later in World War I. It's important as well because it is adopted wholesale into the preamble of the mandate for Palestine that was given by the League of Nations to Great Britain a couple of years later. In other words, it becomes not just a British declaration of war on the Palestinians, telling the Palestinians, you don't exist as a people, you don't have national rights, you don't have political rights. This group, this tiny minority, is going to be encouraged to develop a national home on your land, in your country. This will be done in a way that only preserves your rights to, have property and to worship. So it becomes not just a statement by the British government, it becomes an international commitment in the form of the Mandate for Palestine issued by the League of Nations, the body that emerged from World War I as the international body representing supposedly international legality. I want to say one more thing, which is that Jabotinsky, who I must come back to, wrote in an article in 1923 about something he called an iron wall. And what he said was a colonial movement like this, a settler colonial project like Zionism, can't possibly exist by its own means alone. It needs an iron wall, meaning an external force to protect it. And the British Empire, with the sanction and support of the League of Nations, provided that, repressing the Palestinians all along. And when they finally revolted in a massive armed revolt in 1936 through 1939, the British Empire, through over 100,000 soldiers and policemen, the Royal Air Force, and various horrific repressive tactics, provided that iron wall, crushing Palestinian resistance and breaking the back of the Palestinian national movement, and in basically paving the way for the domination of Palestine by the Zionist movement. So I described the Balfour Declaration as a declaration of war, both because of what it said and implied about the respective rights of the Zionist movement and of Jewish settlers in Palestine, and about the much less significant rights that it provided to the Palestinians, but also because this statement was basically implemented by British bayonets, by the Royal Air Force, by the demolition of homes, by the summary execution of prisoners, and a whole series of other atrocities, which were characteristic for British colonial rule all over the globe, tried and tested in India, tried and tested in Ireland, and implemented in Palestine by the British from 1917 to 1939.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction, Professor. It's very insightful. And I think kind of going on this topic that you're discussing there around how the British and their role in the settler colonial conquest and the role of the League of Nations. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about what was the narrative and what was the agenda within the international community and within the League of Nations at the time, and how was that? How did that materialize? How did that come about?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to understand is that the League of Nations was not really a League of Nations. Most of the world was under colonial rule at the time, so most nations were subjugated and under the thumb of the great colonial powers. Secondly, the League of Nations was entirely dominated by the British and French, by the great powers, and notably Britain and France, the victors of World War I. Other countries that joined were in an entirely subordinate position. So the League of Nations, which nominally represented international legality, in fact represented the great colonial powers. Their view was very much the view of the British. Most European powers went along, as did the United States, with the various principles enunciated in the Balfour Declaration and then further elaborated in the Mandate for Palestine, i.e., the Mandate for Palestine, by the way, never mentions the Palestinians either, and essentially elaborates and takes much further the basic principles that were set forth in the Balfour Declaration. It explains how Britain was supposed to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It explains the measures that Britain was enjoined to take, encouraging close settlement of Jewish immigrants on the land, facilitating their acquisition of property, facilitating their entry into the country, giving them control over their own institutions, elected institutions, which the Palestinians were never allowed to have, by the way, giving them international diplomatic representation. The Mandate for Palestine, in other words, approved by all, by the Council of the League of Nations, basically fleshed out in greater detail the basic principles established by the Balfour Declaration. So basically, the League of Nations completely endorsed this. And then, as a wonderful book by Susan Peterson points out about the League of Nations mandates, the Permanent Mandate Commission, which was supposed to supervise the different mandatory powers, exercise of their authority in the different mandated states, was completely sympathetic to this point of view, to the British point of view, and to the Zionist point of view, and completely unsympathetic to that of the Palestinians.
Interesting. And in terms of how that correlates to some of the agreements that went on around that time in the early 20th century, you had Sykes-Picot, you had the Balfour Declaration, you had the McMahon Correspondence, which you discuss all of these in your book and right. In that first chapter. What was the relationship of these agreements that on the face of them actually appear quite contradictory? And how did these fit in with the kind of the dynamics in the international community?
Well, as far as Palestine was concerned, these three commitments that you've mentioned, the Sykes-Picot, Hussein-McMahon first, that is to say the British commitments to Arab independence between Sir Henry McMahon, the High Commissioner in Cairo, and the Sharif Hussein in Mecca. And secondly, the Sykes-Picot Accords, part of a tripartite agreement between Britain, France, and Russia. But this is the Anglo-French part, which related to the partition of the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire between France and Britain. And finally, the Balfour Declaration, in terms of time, it was the third of the three to have been issued, which, as I've said, promised British support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Were entirely contradictory, leading one wag to describe Palestine as a thrice promised land. Balfour recognized this. He wrote an absolutely extraordinary confidential memo, which was only published, I think, 30 years later, in a collection of British documents on the origins of World War I. Or no, sorry, a collection of British documents on the interwar period, in which he basically recognized that Britain had been acting entirely in bad faith, never meant anything that it said. It's the most extraordinary document. And then he goes on to say, well, having said all of this, having said we made contradictory commitments in the Covenant of the League of Nations, which promised independence to the Arab states and in pledges to the Arabs, and in terms of sending out a commission to look at what people wanted and hearing that they didn't want Zionism and so on and so forth. I think Zionism is right, and we're going to support that. The Arabs will never accept it, but Zionism is more important. And so that's it. It's the most extraordinary piece of writing. Balfour, of course, was one of those highly educated colonial officials. He had started his career as chief secretary in Dublin, holding the Irish down for the British Empire. And he learned his trade well. And by the time he became foreign secretary, he was quite adept at this kind of stuff.
Mm. Interesting. And so in terms of kind of moving on to the dynamics within the Palestinian community and within the Palestinian circles around this time, and how they reacted to the Balfour Declaration and how they reacted to the early Zionist movement. You talk a little bit about your uncle, Dr. Hussein Khalidi, in your book, and you give his accounts and his role within the early Palestinian national movement. What were the conversations that individuals like your uncle, your grandfather Raghib al-Khalidi, and some of the other elites of the Palestinian leadership, and then you have also what were the dynamics and perspectives within civil society?
I think actually it would be useful to go back even further and to look at some of the reactions among Palestinians to the Zionist project, even before the Balfour Declaration. As I pointed out in earlier work, and it's mentioned in this chapter and in the introduction to the book, even before World War I, Palestinians were coming to question the aims and objectives and practices of Zionism. I start the book with a letter from another ancestor of mine to Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, in which he says, I mean, one can understand Zionism, one can understand the persecution that the Jews are subject to in Europe. And you are our cousins. I mean, the idea Muslims have and Jews have, that they're the children, all of them are the children of Abraham. He writes about it. But he says, but Palestine is a country whose population is not going to agree to be supplanted, and please, for heaven's sakes, leave Palestine alone. Herzl, of course, ignores the letter. He responds, but he ignores what this ancestor of mine by the name of Yusuf al-Khalidi was writing. Later on, in the decade before World War I, there's an extensive controversy about Zionism in the Palestinian press. The newspaper Palestine, the newspaper Al-Karmel, and others wrote extensively about Zionism, highly critically about Zionism. And that carries over into the post-war period, especially once people hear about the Balfour Declaration, because now Zionism is not just a project which connects some settlements in different parts of Palestine, or is purchasing land and is removing the peasants from their land when that land is purchased. It is now backed by the power that has occupied Palestine. And that's where things like people like my uncle and others come in. One of the things I point out in the book is that members of the elite, educated urban elites were not the only people who reacted negatively to Zionism. Peasants who were displaced from their land by land purchases from absentee landlords. From the very beginning, from well before World War I, and with increasing frequency as land purchasing continued and accelerated in the interwar period, were very much opposed to what was happening to them. And this was given voice by newspapers like Palestine. So in the book, in addition to quoting extensively from my uncle Dr. Hussein's memoirs, I quote from the memoirs of Isa, who was one of the founders and was the editor of Jarid Palestine, newspaper Palestine, published in Jaffa. And he, from a very early age, was from the beginning of the newspaper in 1911, but certainly through the 20s and the 30s, was writing very harshly, critically about Zionism. He says, we're going to become strangers in our own land if this process continues. So the reaction was not uniform. There were some people who were blind to what was happening. There were some people who were unaware of what was happening. But not just the leading elements of Palestinian society, the leadership, most of it, but many, many people in the cities, in the villages, on the land, were fully aware, especially in the areas of the most intensive penetration by Zionist colonization, were very much aware and very much opposed to it.
Was there a connection between the reaction of the civil society and the reaction of the Palestinian elites? I know when we come on to the 1936 revolt, and this is maybe somewhere you can take this, there is a great intersection. But how did that progress, and how did that develop and materializing to that point?
One of the great lies, one of the great myths propagated by the Zionist movement was that opposition to Zionism was manipulated by elites who were playing on the ignorance of peasants and poor people, and were somehow inciting them or instigating them because their true interests lay with the development of the Zionist movement. In fact, that goes right back to Herzl. Herzl, in his response to the letter that I mentioned that was written by Yusuf Khalidi in 1898 to Herzl to appeal to him to leave Palestine alone, Herzl says, we're going to do good for you. This is Zionist colonization will be for the benefit of the Palestinians. And that was a constant trope. Every colonizer says that. Of course, the French said that to the Algerians, even as they were taking their land, even as they were depriving them of rights. The Boers said that to the Africans in South Africa, and so on and so forth. North America, Australia. Dispossessing you, treating you like animals is for your own good, because we're civilizing you, or whatever the specifics of that discourse are. And so this is of a piece with that argument that Zionism would be good for the natives. That in fact, if there was any opposition, it was misguided and the result of manipulation and incitement and instigation by evil-minded elites. In fact, most resistance was led from below, and most successful or unsuccessful Palestinian efforts to resist did not start at the top. Were not elite instigated. You're right that in 1936 the elite leadership comes together around the demands of strikers, but those strikers, the great general strike of 1936, a 6-month general strike, one of the longest in world history, was not started by the elites. It was started out of dissatisfaction on the part of lower middle class, educated and not so well educated people all across Palestinian society who were fed up with the elites' failure to successfully confront the Zionists, and most importantly, to successfully confront the British, and who took matters into their own hands, and the elites followed that. I think that that's a pattern in Palestinian history, by the way. It happens again with the rise of the Palestinian resistance in the 1950s and 60s. It happens again with the first Intifada in 1987. It's not the leadership that starts these things. It's grassroots, bottom-up efforts that come from within society rather than from the top.
And what was the relationship between these Palestinian institutions, the Palestinian civil society, the British mandate, and the British civil service and institutions that had set up in the British mandate, and the Zionist also institutions and organizations that were being established? How did these all interact, and how did these engage around this period?
Yeah, that's a big question. Let me talk about the Palestinian side first. I think one has to be critical, but at the same time understanding of the difficulties that the Palestinians faced. One has to be understanding because the odds against them were very long odds. I mean, they were up against the British Empire. Between 1918, end of World War I, and 1939, one people on the entire face of the earth succeeded in freeing itself from colonialism. That was the Irish. The only ones. Nobody else succeeded. Empires were expanding. The Japanese Empire was expanding. The Italian Empire was expanding. With the mandate system, the British and the French empires expanded in the interwar period. This was not a period when anti-colonialism was victorious. It was a period when anti-colonialism was developing into the force that ultimately decolonized the world after World War II. But the Zionists had on their side the big battalions. So the Palestinians were up against a particularly difficult set of enemies. Having said that, I think they did not succeed, as did some other movements, either movements that launched armed uprisings against their colonial oppressors earlier, the Egyptians in 1919, the Iraqis in 1920, or movements that developed into mass political movements with middle class as well as elite leadership. And here I'm thinking of the Wafd in Egypt, Hezb al-Wafd, the Wafd party, and I'm thinking of the Congress party in India. Palestinian society did not produce either the one or the other. There was a great armed revolt finally in 1936, but it was much, in effect, much too late. And there never was anything on the level of the Congress Party or on the level of the Hezb al-Wafd, the Wafd Party in Egypt, which ultimately were putting such enormous pressure on the British that they were forced to make concessions. There was nothing at all on the level of Sinn Féin and the IRA in Ireland, which created an alternative governance structure and completely denied legitimacy to the British colonial authorities. The elected Irish representatives in the Westminster Parliament withdrew from Westminster, went to Dublin, created the Dáil, and said, we are the legitimate authority in Ireland, created a government structure, and the IRA was the military arm of that. So Irish nationalism created the legitimate structure of authority in Ireland before the War of Independence. And it fought the War of Independence in that fashion. The Wafd in Egypt, the Congress Party in India, it can be seen to have done something the same without fighting a war of independence in those two cases, obviously. In the case of the Egyptians, they had risen up in 1918, and the result of this was the Wafd. Palestinians didn't have anything like that. They had elite-led, narrowly based factional parties, which were overtaken by events with the general strike of 1936, and then took back control of events. Now, on the other side, you had a movement which was essentially a European movement. Zionism was founded in Europe, was led by Europeans, had its financial and its political base in Europe and the United States. When they were expelled from the Ottoman Empire, David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, the first prime minister and the second president of the State of Israel, came to the United States and spent 3 years organizing and raising money, laying the groundwork for American support for Zionism. That was the base of the Zionist movement, not Palestine. Palestine was where the Zionist movement established itself, created new structures, settled and bought land and settled and so forth. An enormous effort was devoted to Palestine, but that was only possible because of the vast amounts of money that were being raised from the United States and Europe. In the decade of the 50s, the amount of capital transfers into Palestine by the Zionist movement was greater than the gross domestic product of the Jewish economy. Over 100% of what they were producing was coming in annually for 10 years in terms of capital inflow. With that kind of investment, you can do a lot, and they did a lot. But that was not raised in Palestine. That was raised in New York. That was raised in London. That was raised in Europe. So the Palestinians were dealing with a movement which had European leaders who spoke European languages, who were native to the European countries, who could talk to those leaders in whether it was in Paris or it was in London or wherever, or New York. Golda Meir was born in Milwaukee. She's talking the same language with the same background as any American to whom she's speaking. Ben-Gurion is born in Pinsk. He spoke Russian as a native, and so on and so forth. Palestinians did not have those kinds of advantages, neither in terms of an organization and political structure. And by the way, the Zionists were then given advantages by the British mandate in terms of the structures. They were given an elected assembly. They were given diplomatic representation, international diplomatic representation, things that were denied, of course, to the Palestinians. They were given self-governance of things like education and so on. So you had a government in embryo long before Israel is established in 1948. Every institution of the political agency of the the political department of the Jewish agency becomes the foreign ministry. The militias become the Israel Defense Force. I mean, they simply changed name. The same exact structures which have been established over decades under the British mandate as governmental structures or para-governmental structures become governmental structures. The Palestinians failed to create the kind of alternative structures that the Irish did, for example, and they were not allowed to do that, obviously, by the British mandate. So we're talking about, again, a structural disadvantage that is quite palpable.
And then where do the Brits fit in, and how does, in this post-Balfour era,
right,
how did Balfour evolve over the subsequent years?
Balfour himself?
No,
not at all. Not at all. And things did change, but it wasn't Balfour who changed. What happened was quite striking, actually, because between 1917 and 1939, the British, at different points, came to understand that the kind of contradictions that that Balfour talked about in that secret 1919 memo that I mentioned were unsurmountable. And they came up with a variety of solutions, which were shot down systematically, without exception, in London, due to the commitment of British politicians to Zionism and the pressure of supporters of Zionism in London, as well as the same processes operating in Geneva at the League of Nations. The crunch, however, came in 1936-39, because when the revolt broke out, it started as a general strike. There was some violence against the British. The British sent a commission, the Peel Commission under Lord Peel, which came up with recommendations in the spring of 1937, which were so offensive to the Palestinians that they triggered a massive nationwide armed revolt, which over a year and a bit basically took control of large parts of Palestine and put the British on the defensive. The British were facing a crisis in Europe with Hitler. The Anschluss, the events in Czechoslovakia that ultimately led to the Munich agreements in the fall of 1938. It was only then that the British were able to bring enough troops to Palestine to crush the revolt. So the revolt goes on from 36, 37, 38 until the fall of 38, when the British were able to bring 100,000 soldiers. They crushed the revolt. There was one soldier and policeman to every 3 adult male Palestinians. By the end of the revolt, as much as 15 to 17% of the adult male population of Palestine was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled by the British. They broke the back of the resistance. 17%, think of that, 17% of all adult males killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. Some of that in internecine warfare, by the way, because the British and the Zionists split the Palestinian national movement and won over collaborators who fought with them against the guerrillas in the hills. However, the British were on the eve, as everybody knew from the time of the Munich crisis until September 1939, they were on the eve of a war, another war with Germany. And they understood that this war would be fought in part in the Middle East, as had been World War I fought in part in the Middle East. We think of trench warfare. World War I was fought all over the Middle East, from Libya to Mesopotamia, and including Gallipoli and Egypt and Palestine and so on. And they understood that they had completely alienated Arab and Muslim opinion in their brutal suppression of the Palestinian revolt. The Germans and the Italians were making propaganda about it. Even the French were supporting the Palestinian rebels. And in that situation, you had the Viceroy of India, and you had people in British colonial capitals where British colonial officials were stated, writing to London saying, we have to do something to turn the tide of public opinion. We're going to have to fight a war with a largely Indian army, which includes a lot of Muslims and a lot of Hindus who are very supportive of the Palestinians. And we're going to have to fight in the Middle East, in a region where the populations have been completely alienated by our vicious repression of the revolt in Palestine. And so the British, this is not Balfour. Balfour is gone by now. The Chamberlain government issues what is called the White Paper in 1939, which basically reneged on several of their commitments to the Zionist movement. It infuriates the Zionists, and that's a whole other story. It was an opportunity, in my view, which had very limited importance, because Britain was about to cease to be the most important power in the Middle East. The United States and the Soviet Union, within a few years, would be infinitely more important than Britain in the Middle East. And so Britain's White Paper, Britain's involvement ceased to be of paramount importance, as it had been from World War I until 1939.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of with the emergence of the White Paper, and there's this period between 1939 and 1947, which there's a limit, which you don't go into it in your book, and there's actually a limited amount of information that is publicly accounted for in that period. What were the key events that transpired over the course of that time, which, if we think about it, was fundamental in the future establishment of the state of Israel and the future of the Palestinians? Right.
I touch on it at the end of the first chapter, the Balfour chapter, and I talk about it in the first pages of the next chapter, which really focuses on the 1947 partition resolution. The most important of those developments were threefold. The first was the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as the dominant powers of the post-war age. A second is the process of decolonization, which begins immediately after World War II. And the third is the continued growth and expansion of the Zionist movement at a time when the Palestinians failed to recover from the crushing defeat of 36-39. All of this is taking place against the background of the Holocaust. The Holocaust changes everything. In fact, the rise to power changes everything. Back in 1933, before Hitler comes to power, the Zionist movement looked like it was not going to succeed. Between 1927 or 28 and 1933, the total Jewish population of Palestine as a proportion of the whole stagnated. It ceased to grow. It had gone from about 6% in 1917 to about 17 or 18% of the whole in 1926-27. It stagnated at that level, partly due to the Great Depression and for other reasons. Hitler's arrival in power puts the Zionist movement on steroids. First of all, it apparently justifies a core argument of the Zionist movement. We can't live in Europe. These people are so fundamentally anti-Semitic that they will make our lives in Europe impossible. And the Nazis apparently proved this by their behavior in Germany immediately after they come into power, and ultimately through the Holocaust, starting in 1942. I mean, the killings start even before, but the systematic industrial genocide against the Jews, against gypsies, against homosexuals, and so on, is really only implemented from 1942 with the Wannsee meeting. And that's the background to all of this. In 1935, 60,000 Jewish immigrants arrived in Palestine. That's the total Jewish population of Palestine in 1917. And Ben-Gurion writes, if immigration in his diaries, if immigration continues at this rate, a Jewish Palestine is assured. We're going to control the country demographically. We'll have a majority if this continues. That's one, of course, these developments are one of the reasons for the revolt of 36-39. The Palestinians could see, as well as anybody, that 60,000 a year means there's going to be a Jewish majority within a few years. So, and then you have the Holocaust, Hitler, and then the Holocaust. And that conditions the way people look at Palestine in the post-war years. It still conditions the way people look at Palestine. They don't see Palestine for Palestine. They see Palestine in terms of Jewish history. And in Jewish history, this enormously important event of the Holocaust is seen as driving a great deal, if not everything, in the post-World War II era. And then you have the Americans and the Soviets, who each, for their own reasons, in the case of the Americans for domestic as well as strategic reasons, President Truman is influenced by the fact that he needs to gain re-election, and to get re-election, he needs the support of people who are supporters of Zionism. Stalin has his own calculations, mainly having to do with getting the British out of the Middle East. He was obsessed with the British, Stalin. In fact, both of the superpowers wanted to get the British out of the Middle East and to replace them. And that's partly the genesis of the partition resolution, which is essentially an American-Soviet resolution, strong-armed through the General Assembly by the two great powers. Britain did not vote for partition, by the way. So it is an American-Soviet resolution. It wasn't a British idea.
In terms of thinking about the implications today and how events have transpired, at least particularly as we look at kind of the recognition of Israel by some of the Arab states, and something that I think is important for the audience to be conscious of and to hear a little bit about. How do we think about kind of the history of the Palestinian-Israeli question and its evolution in the context of where we are today, and maybe some of the thoughts of how this will affect Palestinian identity moving forwards, and the identity of the Palestinian cause?
Let me talk first to the Arab dimension, and then I'll talk about the Palestinians. I think there are two constants which you can see from the 1930s until 2020, as far as the Arabs and Palestine are concerned. The first is that Arab public opinion has been supportive of the Palestinians from the beginning to today. There are reliable polls taken over 10,000 respondents by the Arab Center in Qatar, which show overwhelming support for Palestinians in, I think, 11 Arab countries, from Saudi Arabia to Algeria, and which show that the idea of normalization with Israel is anathema to overwhelming majorities of Arabs in every single one of the countries surveyed. That is consistent with the views of people before World War I. The newspapers that I surveyed, I read several hundred articles in dozens of newspapers all over the Arab world in the period before 1914. The majority of them are hostile to or critical of Zionism. So from 1914 to 2020, on the one hand, we have a consistency in the attitude of Arab public opinion, generally speaking, to Palestine. The second thing that has to be said is that Arab governments and Arab elites have not always been faithful to the views of their peoples. This was true in different ways in the 1930s. This was true in different ways in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. In fact, there have been times when Arab governments have acted against the Palestinians. We had Syrian intervention against the PLO at the height of the war in Lebanon. I was living there at the time. I remember it well. We had Black September in Jordan. We've had assassinations of Palestinian leaders, one after another, by supposedly Palestinian groups, backed by the intelligence service of Iraq, backed by the intelligence service of Syria, backed by the intelligence service of Libya. So these three Arab governments were carrying, these Arab regimes, these undemocratic Arab regimes, were carrying out covert war against the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So the people are in one place. The governments are sometimes in another place. So when the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain normalized relations with Israel, it's ludicrous to talk about make peace with Israel, because these countries didn't exist when Israel was established. They were British colonies, protectorates, controlled by the British. At the time Israel was established, they never were at war with Israel. So they didn't make peace with Israel. They normalized relations with Israel. They established diplomatic relations with Israel, or in the process of establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. When they do this, they're just the last in a long line of Arab countries, of Arab regimes, I should say, which have put their regime interests or their nation state interests above the views, in most cases, of their peoples. Insofar as we can ascertain those views. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, the other thing that has to be said about the Arab countries is, it is probably true that there has been a decline in interest in the Palestine question, because overwhelmingly serious crises are affecting Arab countries in different ways from one end of the region to the other. You had the Arab Spring of 2011. You had the repression of the democratic movements by the capitals of reaction, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, together with other forces, putting down revolts where they could, subsidizing generals in Egypt or Sudan or wherever they could, intervening in Syria and so forth. And you then have had running sores developing in the form of the ongoing war in Libya, the ongoing war in Yemen, the ongoing war in Syria. And finally the American occupation of Iraq and the wars that have followed that. Understandably, people are obsessed and understandably distracted by what's going on in their backyard. So if you're Algerian and there's a popular movement for more than a year to oppose the regime that's been in place since the coup of 1965, the military regime, understandably, this is going to be at the forefront of your interests and your concerns. As far as the Palestinians' future of the Palestinians, I mean, this is a very big question. Obviously, Ramzi, I can't answer it in 3 minutes. Let me just say that I think this is something that has to be seen in the long term. The British start to colonize Ireland 700 or 800 years ago. It's not until 1921 that the Irish begin to gain independence. I'm not suggesting it's going to take us 700 years. But what I am suggesting is that this idea that because things are really bad right now, which they are, obviously, we should all be, saying, woe is me. Palestinian the Palestinian national movement and the Palestine question has gone through some pretty grim times before. I mean, what happens at the end of the 36-39 revolt, what happens in 1947 and subsequent years are some very low points. We've been through low points before, in other words, we as Palestinians. And at the same time, unexpectedly, things have turned around. I mean, the period after the 1948 war, after the Nakba, after the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, it was assumed, certainly by the Israelis and by many of their friends, that the problem was solved. They'd expelled the people, they'd taken over, Palestine had been replaced by Israel. End of discussion. That's not what happened. And I think you can see that quite frequently, when things look particularly grim in the wake of the 1982 war, the expulsion of the PLO from Lebanon, you have the first Intifada in 1987, only 5 years later. I'm not suggesting something specific is going to happen necessarily today, tomorrow, next year, or the year after. Palestinians are in a particularly grim situation because of having unrepresentative, politically bankrupt leaderships with no strategy and no willingness to do anything for the common good, interested only in their self-preservation, both in Ramallah and in Gaza, without exception. At the level of political leadership, the Palestinians are extremely ill-served. Not the first time that's been the case, by the way. If you look at how the 1936-39 revolt proceeded, you can see that external powers, the Zionists and the British, succeeded in playing on differences that existed within Palestinian society and within the Palestinian leadership. And I would argue that every external power playing in Palestine today, whether it's Qatar or Turkey or Iran or Israel or the United States, is intent on maintaining the division of the Palestinians. And anybody who serves them is not serving the interests of the Palestinian people. Anybody who maintains the interest of Ramallah at the expense of the Palestine cause, or the interest of Gaza, or the interest of this faction or that faction, is objectively serving the subjugation of the Palestinian people, the continued occupation, the continued colonization of Palestine, whatever they say they're doing, whatever they think they're doing. And I think that's obvious to a lot of Palestinians, and that's why I actually, on that and other grounds, I'm optimistic.
Well, thank you very much for that, Professor Khalidi, and thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us and share some information on your most recent book, The 100 Years War on Palestine. I would implore everybody in the audience to read that book. It is, if not the best, if not the best, one of the best books that I've come across in the context of the history of Palestine and the Palestinian settler colonial conquest. So please do purchase the book and read it. And thank you again.
You're welcome,
Professor. It's been a pleasure.
The book's available in paperback in the UK already, so you won't have to shell out for a hardcover version. Thank you very much for hosting me. I hope everybody enjoyed this. And I hope you do have a chance to look at the book. People sometimes say to me, how do I deal with this or that argument? Oh, the way you deal with this or that argument, it's the kinds of things that are thrown at us, is to make yourself very well informed. And this is one of the ways you can start to make yourself very well. Read the book, read the footnotes, look at the sources, and see, go even deeper. And that will enable you to not just win the arguments, but see some of the details that help us to understand why we are where we are, why the Palestine question is where it is, but also possibly how we can get out of the situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure.